Welcome to Intelligence Squared. I'm Maithili Rao. I know of very few places more beautiful than Charlottesville, Virginia. The city is nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and it's laden with history. It was once home to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the third president of the United States. But in his view, his greatest accomplishments, the three single achievements he wanted listed on his tombstone, were his work as the author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of Virginia's Statute for Religious Freedom, and his role as the father of the University of Virginia, which I attended more than 20 years ago. It was firmly impressed on us students that UVA was a special project of Jefferson's, and it's a place that to this day emphasizes student governance and takes the ideals of democracy very seriously. So it was with a special horror that I watched the events of August 2017, when over 1,000 far-right neo-Nazis, fascists, Klan members, and neo-Confederates descended on Charlottesville. They marched down the University of Virginia's historical lawn with tiki torches, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And before the weekend was over, one of their ranks had driven a car into a throng of counter-protesters, killing a young woman named Heather Hare and injuring dozens of other people. That weekend, we also saw footage of a young black man named DeAndre Harris being beaten by a crowd of white supremacists. Deborah Baker is a biographer and archivist whose work has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She grew up in Charlottesville, and she was also horrified by what she saw that weekend, so much so that it set her off on a multi-year research project, searching for answers not just about what happened that day, but also for a deeper understanding of the decades of history in Charlottesville leading up to that point. Her book is called Charlottesville, An American Story. It's excellent. I learned a lot from it. I highly recommend it. Welcome to Intelligence Squared, Deborah.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me, Maithili.
To start with, for those who maybe don't remember so clearly what happened in August of 2017, do you want to describe what went on at the Unite the Right rally?
Well, it was first of all, it was preceded by a sort of pop-up rally over Mother's Day weekend in May, where a very well-known white nationalist named Richard Spencer, suddenly showed up in the park where a statue of Robert E. Lee was staged, and they sang the Hitler Youth song from Cabaret. They chanted, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." They chanted, "Russia's our friend," and then they disappeared. But that sort of got the summer going, and then a local sort of troller, white racist, decided he wanted to stage an even bigger rally. So he applied for a permit with the city, and that was the rally that became the Unite the Right. And so, yeah, that was on August 12th, 2017.
There's a lot we'll get to with the rally, but before we dive in, I want to go back a little bit farther. You grew up in Virginia. I did too. I like the way you describe Virginia as the daughter Queen Elizabeth never had with Sir Walter Raleigh, which I took to mean a place that was very colonial in its founding, but also infused maybe with a certain spirit of discovery and possibility. Revisiting Virginia and Virginia history for this book, after many years of living in New York and elsewhere, what stood out to you about the kinds of stories Virginia tells about itself?
Well, I experienced that story as a school child. There's colonial Williamsburg, and then of course there's the visit to Monticello, which is this beautiful plantation home on a hill overlooking Charlottesville. Um, and you said in your introductory remarks that Charlottesville used to be the home of Thomas Jefferson. He so much still lives there. Um, you're just aware of this house. You can see it practically from all over the city. Look up at this mountain, and it's a beautiful house. It's got his libraries. It's got his various inventions, clever little clocks, his bedroom, his study. it's very overwhelming. And of course, when I was, being taken around by a guide or with my class, we heard about the servants, but we didn't get much information about Jefferson as an enslaver.
I remember going on that tour too, and the thing that is emphasized about the servants is the dumbwaiter system that Jefferson invented in Monticello, which is a way for kind of food and things to be brought into the dining area without the slaves or servants preparing that food to be visible. And it was sort of presented as one of his many eccentric and sort of innovative inventions. Um, and it was only much later that that tour was updated to address more directly the role of slaves in his
Where you
home. And I
got to
think
see the kitchen, you got to
yes,
go down into the kitchen and see where all this food magically was prepared.
yes, and I think you're right to note that Jefferson still, in some ways, lives in Charlottesville and looms over Charlottesville. You chronicle in great detail, though, the way his writings not only laid the foundation for American democracy, a story that most Americans are quite familiar with, but also how his language around individual liberty and natural rights early on attracted the admiration of white supremacists, among them Ezra Pound, the poet, who was openly a supporter of fascism. And he wrote a book comparing Jefferson and Mussolini. Can you talk a little bit about this school of thought?
Yeah, I mean, when I first, saw the footage of the Unite the Right, I wasn't really, and the Nazi flags and stuff. I couldn't really understand what the connection between Confederate statue, because supposedly this rally was organized to protest the city's decision to remove this statue of Robert E. Lee from what was then Lee Park. So I couldn't really figure what does the Civil War and the Confederacy have to do with Hitler and why uh, fascism. That was just sort of I just couldn't make that connection. And it wasn't until I didn't think I was going to write about the Unite the Right. I mostly work out of archives. I mostly write about dead people, and I have sort of in the course of trying to figure out where these people came from and what their ideological orientation was, I came across this story of Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was, an American poet living in Mussolini's Italy in the 30s and throughout the war. And he did these series of war broadcasts, you know, trying to convince America not to come into the war. And after he was eventually arrested, imprisoned, and put on trial for treason. Because he was such an influential poet and translator, eventually his lawyer got him institutionalized in this insane asylum in Washington, D.C. So, in the wake of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, when the South was being forced to desegregate, um, all of a sudden these men started appearing at Pound's knee and getting this full on dose of not just fascism and anti Semitism, but which was surprising to me because I knew Pound as a fascist and an anti Semite. But I hadn't realized his investment in white supremacy. And, so this one fellow, Columbia University graduate who showed up at St. Elizabeth's, which was the name of the hospital, um, basically wanted to stir up some trouble. So on Pound's advice, he chose Charlottesville and he went down to Charlottesville with the intention of starting a race war. And, and Charlottesville at that time had a Jewish mayor, and basically everyone was blaming the Jewish mayor for putting Charlottesville was one of the first cities to be the NAACP was trying to get desegregated. So the relationship really was, Dixie flavored kind of white supremacy. Pound sent this fellow down. His name was John Casper, along with all these sort of speeches. He had a rally in a local park, and was basically read out Pound speeches, making the connection between sort of Dixie flavored white supremacy and desegregation, and the role that Jews played in, you know, putting making Charlottesville the target.
It
So
sounds
it was huge to see this. It was uncanny to see this mirror image of Unite the Right, taking place in the summer of 1956.
Was that something the organizers of Unite the Right were aware of?
No, and this is the way, history gets whitewashed, is that, that unpleasantness of that period. There was a petition. The vast majority of white Charlottesville signed a petition to not desegregate their schools. They were in total um, defiance of the Supreme Court decision. And, it was signed by 20,000 white Charlottesville people, and that petition is gone. I look for it everywhere, seeing, who I would have known who had signed that petition. And I already see, a certain ways in which the university and the city of Charlottesville is trying to forget and erase what happened in 2017.
I want to ask you a little more about that era of fights over desegregating schools, because in your archival research, you also came across the papers of a Charlottesville housewife named Sarah Patton Boyle. I found her to be a fascinating figure and someone whose experience tells a pretty tragic story about the South and about Charlottesville in particular. She was raised on, as you put it, fairy tales about the South, about sort of a genteel sense of duty and nobleness in her lineage and in what she understood to be uh, the place she lived in. But then in 1950, with the help of the NAACP, the first Black student is admitted to UVA's law school, Gregory Swanson, and that's when Sarah Patton Boyle kind of sets off on a crusade. What happened?
Yes. Yeah, Sarah Patton Boyle is what is called FFB in Virginia, First Families of Virginia. I'm not FFB,
I'm
but
not
they were
either.
a distinct demographic. And you just never stopped hearing about them. That meant that she was descended from the original settlers of Virginia who received these land grants from the crown. Her grandparents were big slave owners. They had a huge plantation not far from Shadwell, where Jefferson was born. So, her mother would, drill into her mind that she was descended from the very best people of Virginia, the very best of the very best. And since these families tended to marry each other, they were a pretty discrete genotype. Um, so that was her upbringing. But she was also raised as a devout Episcopalian. Her father was a minister, an Episcopal minister, or Anglican, I guess, minister. And she saw this as a moral cause, and that she felt that the good people of Virginia, people like her and First Families of Virginia, would do the right thing, vis-a-vis their dusky brothers. There's just something about her sort of Lady Bountiful, you know, patronizing, well-meaning, but totally clueless, that really resonated with me. And so she decided she was going to provide the one woman sort of welcoming committee for Jeffrey Swanson, and to school him like on what lines he couldn't cross, in case, he thought, she couldn't have him over to her house, for example, because, that would just be too unsettling. So, and of course, all he wanted to do was go to law school and make some friends. And, he didn't see himself as, a one man, you know, he just wanted to lay low and to get his law degree. But she kept inserting herself into that situation. And eventually he just left because it was not a pleasant experience being the first Black law student. But it was eye-opening for her, and she ended up befriending this local Black newspaper man, and he had her, like, write letters, as to for his newspaper, putting out her argument that that the best people in Virginia would step up, and they very much did not, and that was quite an awakening for her, and probably by the time desegregation actually happened, she was a total pariah in her community, and in her family. So I did find that was a tragic story, and it's sort of because Charlottesville now prides itself on being so progressive and so um, democratic, but it's actually a deeply, deeply conservative place in ways that they don't even recognize.
So let's go back now to 2017, um, when the Unite the
Unite.
Right rally that August came after an extended period of soul searching in Charlottesville, which all kicked off with a discussion over whether or not it was time to get rid of or move a very prominent statue of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. Charlottesville has a very lively civic life. There were meetings, there were discussions, there were letters in the newspaper. You chronicle all of this, and I think we should talk about it in more detail. But first, can you explain how that statue of Lee, someone who never visited Charlottesville, came to be in the city in the first place?
Yes, well, Charlottesville had a benefactor who made a lot of money in the Chicago stock market, and just loved Charlottesville and retired there, and he bought up bits of land, and threw up all these statues. The Robert E. Lee statue wasn't even the only statue he put up. There was a statue of Meriwether Lewis and Clark. Meriwether Lewis grew up just down the road from where I grew up, out in Ivy, west of town, and as did Clark's brother, who was instrumental in clearing the West of Native and indigenous tribes. So you had this monument to um, ethnic cleansing with those two statues, and then you had in the downtown area a statue of Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, both equestrian statues. So it was, and this fellow whose name was Paul Goodloe McIntyre. He also donated a big park to the white community, and then another sort of smaller park to the Black community. And UVA has the McIntyre School of Commerce. His name is really everywhere. There's a McIntyre Road, the McIntyre Park. So yeah, he's literally inscribed all over the city. And it was the Lee statue he put up in 1924 was dedicated to his parents, who he was a young boy when the war took place.
So Lee was just someone who his parents had an affinity for. So it was just a pet kind of interest of his.
Yes.
Um, and
But the statue, the week preceding the statue's unveiling, and the um, week that followed it, was accompanied by a massive Klan march down Main Street of Charlottesville. There was a cross burning on a mountain near Monticello. There was a church bombing, a Black church bombing, that a cross was erected in its ruins. So it was very clear. It was a moment of celebration for white Charlottesville, but for the Black community, the formerly enslaved, the freedmen, they got the message very clearly about what the statue meant for them.
then the statue just sort of sat there without much controversy for many decades until this question of whether or not it should stay or whether it should continue to be in Charlottesville at all is raised. What made that question finally get asked in a public forum? And when you listen through the meetings and discussions and arguments around it, how did those conversations play out?
Well, initially, the it was raised by a petition. There was a young Charlottesville, born and bred Charlottesville Black student named Ziona Bryant, who was asked in her high school freshman class, if you could change one thing about Charlottesville, what would it be? And Ziona decided that she would like to get rid of the Confederate statue. So that was her homework assignment. It became a petition. It stirred up a lot of immediate uh, pushback from the community. Then a very ambitious young city council member named Wes Bellamy took it up. It became sort of a platform for him to get this done. The laws had changed so that it was a possibility. So the city council decided to have this commission. So there were hearings, there was public feedback, and in the course of this commission's hearings, which I listened to, I heard how white Charlottesville saw and thought of these statues. And initially, they far outnumbered the voices of the Black community, the voices of the activist community. But eventually, in the course of the hearings, the activists managed to create a consensus that it was time to get rid of the statue. And a lot of the older white Charlottesville people were, very upset about that. But then there was this sort of appearance suddenly in the park where the statue was, all these, another group called the Virginia Flaggers began showing up. These are people who, were guarding the statue with guns and, basically they were there every night, holding a vigil to keep, the activists from making a move on the statue. So it became a very fraught situation. And it was into this kind of fraught local tempest over the statue that Richard Spencer decided to make some hay.
You describe Richard Spencer and the alt-right as peddling an old-fashioned white nationalism and white supremacy with its grab bag of bigotries, wrapped in contrarian, countercultural, and hypermasculine cool. Sort of this repackaging of old ideas. What was Richard Spencer trying to prove by organizing a rally in Charlottesville?
I think he was trying to provoke. I mean, he was building his brand. And it was a very clean-cut, collegiate look. These were the polo shirts and the khaki pants and the sharp navy suits and ties and fancy sunglasses. They were sort of normalizing this expression of, this is our ground. This is our ground. Charlottesville is our home territory. He was a graduate of the University of Virginia, and he was. I was interested to figure out that he was a student, undergraduate student at UVA, studying music and history at the same time that the whole Sally Hemings DNA controversy came to a head. So I think he got a really clear sense of, how he could use Jefferson and our sense of Jefferson on his behalf. He wasn't just about the Confederate statue. He really wanted to appropriate Jefferson for white nationalism. That was his agenda. And yeah.
A great deal of your book focuses on August 11th and August 12th, 2017 specifically. that famous tiki torch march that ended in violence on the lawn at the University of Virginia. And then the next day, the demonstrations and counter demonstrations, which resulted in Heather Hare being killed by a Unite the Right sympathizer, neo Nazi, driving his car through a crowd. I watched the news in shock that weekend, like a lot of other people. I saw lots of video clips in the hours and days afterwards. But this is the first time I'd really read such a detailed TikTok of how the Unite the Right organizers laid out their plans, kind of communicated, kind of adjusted as they saw a growing opportunity that weekend, and how counter protesters kind of frantically were trying to strategize ways to slow this, stop this without being harmed, without putting vulnerable people in harm's way, right up until the moment when people were harmed. It's very jarring reading, and it flies, of course, right in the face of what President Trump said right after the rally, which was there were fine people on both sides. I could tell in the book that that irked you. I mean, you write about that phrase really
Well,
bothering you.
yeah, I mean, that to me, I watched all that unmediated coverage, and it's very hard to know what was going on, who was fighting whom. It just looked amorphous, and then you saw that footage of the car attack over and over and over again, and so much of the coverage, of that weekend. First of all, there were no mainstream media outlets covering new, the Torch March. It was all citizen journalists who were close to the ground, who understood what was going to happen. There was one Washington Post reporter who was there. The Times saw it as a local story. They weren't interested in covering it. They were prepared to cover the rally itself, but I just thought there's so much that you don't know unless you live there in Charlottesville about the buildup, about the discussions over the statue, about the Klan rally that happened a month before, and what was so. And so I really wanted to tell the story, tell what happened from a local point of view, from the point of view of the people who saw what was coming and tried to warn city officials, tried to warn the university, and were just basically ignored and if or treated as a threat themselves. So that was the story that I wanted to tell. I'm not a journalist. I felt no obligation whatsoever to interview Richard Spencer or any of the alt-right, neo-Confederate, neo-Nazi, neo-fascist people. I feel like the media was obsessed with them and giving them enough ink as it was. So but I needed to tell how they came together too, so that people understand just how dangerous they were and how much of a threat they posed to the community. And but also, tell the story of the activists, the anti-racist activists, the anti-fascist activists, and not use the language that you hear the media using, Black Bloc, Antifa, all that cant, which is really far right cant that they appropriate.
There were investigations within Charlottesville after this about what happened, about what the police knew and when, and why certain calls were made and weren't made. Do you think outside of Charlottesville, any of this has been revisited apart from your book? Do you think there is any sense of what actually happened that day, um, or is this sort of both sides narrative really just taken hold?
The report that was done by Tim Healy was a really good report. He spoke to a lot of the activists. He spoke to the city officials. He pointed out where the failures had happened. And what is interesting is that it's a total parallel with January 6th, which he also was the main investigator on. The amount of intelligence that the FBI, Homeland Security, Capitol Police had on what was going to happen on January 6th. It's just stunning. Yet they also had this blind spot. They just could not see these people as a threat. And so they were completely unprepared equally. And so I was very interested in that the construction of that blind spot, the fear of activists, the fear of street protests. And even now we see, Democratic politicians, telling, people in Los Angeles what is an appropriate way to protest these immigration raids. And there's just something about people on the streets just scares people. But hopefully, I maybe eventually will get past that because there's nothing else between us and the abyss but these street protests.
Well, you also said that people you love had said things to you like, "Oh, the counter protesters shouldn't have been on the street. That's what you get when you get on the street." How
Yeah,
do you respond to that?
with this book, um,
Yeah.
that was like, yeah, I have, you know, family members who, weren't there on the streets, and who are threatened by that kind of shouting and obscenities and signs. And yeah, it's and so I did want to, and there's part of me that also, I'm not a bullhorn kind of person. And so I wanted to interrogate that. It's about self-reflection as well. That I talk a lot in the book about this sleeping dog, and this fear, like especially with Trump. Don't get them too upset. Curb yourself. Don't use bad words. Don't someone else is going to pay the price if you make too much of a fuss. And I think that's a real thing. But if you just are always worried about the sleeping dog and not waking up the sleeping dog, then you're never going to see anything approaching justice.
We started the conversation talking about Charlottesville's history, how it tells that history, how it remembers that history, how it makes use of that history, also what is forgotten. I was last there in 2022, and I got to see the relatively new memorial to enslaved laborers that was built at the University of Virginia, which went up in 2019. I also saw memorials on the downtown mall where Heather Hare was killed. I saw the plaques that the Blue Ribbon Commission has put around the city to remember different aspects of Black history in Charlottesville. And I was honestly impressed with what I saw as like a city trying to openly reckon with its history, piece by piece, and to try to take ownership of the stories it told. It felt like something other cities could learn from. But you end the book feeling kind of wary about whether the story of America can be melted down and retold, as you put it. Um, how did you kind of land where you landed?
Well, I mean, I think that's eventually what happened to the Robert E. Lee statue. It's the only Confederate statue that's actually been destroyed. Most of them are sitting in city storage facilities that have been taken down because in the summer of 2020, a lot of these statues came down really all over the world. But Confederate statues came down in America. Even Christopher Columbus statues have come down. So, and Trump is now threatening to, bring them back. But, there were women, visionary women in Charlottesville who understood that this was going to be, a flashpoint. This statue was going to be a flashpoint. So they melted it down. And the idea that they came up with, this is a project called Swords into Plowshares, whereby, they put out a bid for artists to say, okay, we've got, however many 5,000 pounds of these bronze ingots, come to us with a proposal for a work of art or whatever you think is appropriate, uh, and give us something that will represent all our stories. And so that's an ongoing project. And I just think that what can we do that with history? I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I do feel like, Trump is doing his best to, you know, destroy the history that we've only recently discovered. And I feel sorry for the generation of children who are in these schools now and not having the benefit of, this really hard-earned story that we've been trying to tell of, not me, but historians have been trying to tell things that, I only recently have learned myself about, slavery, about, um, indigenous, genocide. It's hard history. It's threatening history to certain people, but it's really, really important if we're to be the country that we think we are.
Deborah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matili.
That was Deborah Baker, author of Charlottesville, An American Story, which is available online or at a bookshop near you. I'm Maithili Rao. You've been listening to Intelligence Squared. Thank you for joining us.